Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our first automation hour of 2020. So if you are joining us for the first time, all lines are muted. Please pose any questions that you have to our Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community. And just so you know, we will be posting the recording as well as the link to the deck sometime after the session. So be on the lookout for that on our Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community, as well as our website, automationhour.com, and we will also be tweeting that out. So we are currently booked out through the end of July, and I'm going to be kicking off this first session, but we have Rakesh who will be doing our next session, and we have David starting in February. We did add a special session on here, January 31st, where we have the Salesforce Process Automation Product Managers, Jason Teller and Shannon Hale, and they will come on and talk about all the goodies that are coming to us in spring 20. So if you have not registered for that, I would definitely go and register. Even if you can't attend these sessions live, you will get a link to the recording after the fact. And since we're only booked up through the end of July, if you have a process business use case and cool process automation solution for that, direct message us, and when the time comes, we will reach out to you to get you slotted in. And we cannot bring this free online webinar series to you without our sponsor, Concrete.io. So thank you so much. And here are your co-hosts, David Litton, myself, and Rakesh. All right, so I'm really excited to come back and present and start off the new year presenting. And when I was thinking about what topic I should come up and talk about for this presentation, we really did some crowdsourcing of what my presentation would be covering. So I think the topics came down to basic flow, and then the what one was the modularized componentized flow. So I'll be talking about that in a little bit. But before that, for those of you who don't know me, I am the lead solution designer at John Hancock. I'm also a 4-time MVP. I blog about Salesforce at jenwlee.com, where I post a lot of how-tos on Process Builder and Flow. I also do summaries of the upcoming releases. I'm a lightning champion for activation and app development. I've spoken at multiple Salesforce hosted events such as Dreamforce Trailhead DX World Tours, as well as community events such as Northeast Dreamin', Midwest Dreamin', Southeast Dreamin'. I am a Rad Woman graduate, so that is a free 10-week training series that covers Apex coding. So if you're interested in that, they do have windows that are open throughout the year. So go to the Rad Women Trailblazer community to find out more information on when those windows are open. I love Trailhead. I am an 8-time Ranger, and I have the golden hoodie. So I want to give a shout out to Cactus Force. That's going to be next week. So that's a community run event. It's focused for Salesforce developers and architects, but this year they added a configurator track. So I will be presenting there. My session is Work Smart, Not Hard, Automate and Forget Repetitive User Maintenance Activities. So if you're there, definitely come by and say hi. So for my agenda, I'm going to talk about how to apply the dry concept to declarative automation. And then we're going to take a look at 4 use cases in how I came up with the modularized flow design. So we're really focused on 2020, work smart, not hard, as my coworker Mike Feria says. And just one thing to note that I know people attending have all sorts of different skill sets when it comes to flow. This is an intermediate topic. So I don't expect beginners to start building these things smartly, because you're really trying to learn the new concepts of flow. But as you're getting more comfortable with building flows, definitely keep this in mind. So what is DRY? DRY stands for Don't Repeat Yourself. It's a software development concept that essentially takes large code and breaks it into more manageable chunks. So build them into components, and the idea is that you build it once, call it multiple times, therefore you're also maintaining the code once and not multiple times. So the violation of a DRY solution is what solution? So known as write everything twice, we enjoy typing, waste everyone's time. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to start with the 4 use cases. Our first use case is Addison Dogster is an admin Elever, and Sally Sunshine is our operations manager. So Sally goes to Addison and says, I want to give the finance department users these certain permissions, and I want to give our sales division users these other permissions. So what Addison does is she creates the ABC permission set and assigns it to the finance department, and she creates a DEF permission set and assigns it to the sales division user. So easy peasy, done, right? But not really. Because we're all human, right? We don't want to leave it to a person to remember to add and remove people to permission sets accordingly. And permission sets really give additional access to users, and we should always keep in mind least privilege access and only give our users enough permissions to do their jobs. Some permission sets really give a lot of elevated rights, such as view PII data, view encrypted data, and that's things that you wouldn't want to expose to people who shouldn't be able to see it as part of their job. So a customer service rep might need to see an SSN on a customer, but a salesperson should not have access to that information. So especially in highly regulated industries, you really want to ensure that people have the proper access that they need. So when Sally leaves the finance department and moves to the sales division, we're going to automatically remove that ABC permission set and add the DEF permission set via automation. And then as Justice joins the finance department, we're automatically adding the ABC permission set. So what we want to do in terms of the automation and have Salesforce do the remembering for us is we want to identify business rules criteria that we could automate, and then really use Process Builder and Flow to do that adding and removing of users to and from the permission set. So here's a solution that Addison came up with. She has one process to add and remove the ABC permission set for the finance department users, and a flow to add the ABC permission set, and another flow to remove the ABC permission set. And then she has a similar process, add and remove DEF permission set for the sales division users, and add DEF permission set flow, as well as a remove DEF permission set flow. So as we know, there's a lot of different ways to do something in Salesforce, and this solution is probably fine if you had 2, 3, 5 permission sets in your org. But what org only has 4 or 5 permission sets in their org? Imagine over time that your org is going to grow from 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 permission sets. And you have that one process and two flow for every single permission set. So, so you see from the illustration that it just will grow tremendously over time. And if you need to make a change to that process and flow, can you imagine having to touch every single process and flow in your org, regression test it, and then deploy it to production? So that just becomes a maintenance nightmare, and this design pattern is no longer sustainable. So what we want to do in 2020, we're going to work smart, not hard. We're going to componentize. So what you want to avoid is creating these flows that are very similar in nature or maybe exactly the same, and then building it for each individual use case. What we want to do is componentize your flow and make it more genericized and reusable over and over again. Sure, this will take a bit longer to come up with that design, but ultimately you will reap the benefits of spending the time upfront so that you're not increasing maintenance costs and all that later on when you need to make a change to these processes. Because, you know, who wants to spend time doing production support when you could be working on cool, fancier things, right? So what we want to do is use, in this case, Process Builder to do the heavy lifting for us and send the information into this genericized flow so that flow knows what to do with the information to process it. And in our Process Builder, we want to have one process to manage the assignments of the permission sets, adding or removing it. So a similar concept that we have in code is one trigger per object. So we want to strive for one process builder per object. And you can also control the order of execution when it comes to the to processes that run on that object. So the improved solution is to have a componentized process and flow. So what Addison ended up doing was now have one process that just handles adding or removing users from perm sets. So we're able to cover the finance department, sales division, call center, and all the other scenarios. And we have one flow that manages the adding or removing users from perm set as opposed to the two. So just quickly to review what is identified as criteria in the process. Here's what we set up for a new finance user, and we're using a formula that fires off of if there's a new user record and that user's department is finance, then we're going to invoke a flow, and that's the flow that I showed you in the previous slide, and we'll go through a demo in a little bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the process builder to send information into my flow. So in the variable var user ID, I'm passing in the user's ID. In the var PB permission set action, I'm passing over the string add because we're going to add a permission set. And then lastly, var permission set name, I'm passing a string ABC underscore permission underscore set. And that's the API of the permission set because I do not hard code IDs into my processes and flows. One reason being is if you're creating a record that's net new and you're referencing it in a sandbox and you move it up the regions to another sandbox, your set environment, your UAT environment, and then eventually production, they will all have separate IDs. So then you end up having to clone and then change the IDs in each region, and that just becomes unmanageable. So bad practice there, just like you wouldn't hard code IDs in code. So another scenario here is the existing user was previously finance department. So we're checking on the user is active, the prior value for the department is finance, and the user's department is changed. And again, I'm invoking that same flow, still passing over the user ID in the variable user ID. Var PB permission set action, I'm passing the string remove because we're going to remove the permission set. And var permission set name, I'm going to pass over again the same string ABC underscore permission underscore set. That is the API name for the permission set. So to get everyone in the same page, because not everyone may assign users permission sets in their job, the way that permission set assignments work is there's the user object, there is the permission set object that has your custom permissions and all the permissionings that are associated with that perm set, and then there is a junction object called permission set assignment that holds the assignee ID, so that's the user ID, and then the permission set ID. So with those, if you find a record that has assignee ID and a permission set ID, that means that user is assigned to that permission set. So there could be a none to many relationship between the user and permission set assignment. Same with the permission set. Okay, and then another thing to keep in mind with permission sets is when we're building, in general, when we're building declarative automation, what we want to think about is think in the mindset of a developer, and we want to safeguard our flows that we're building against failures. So in the setup, when you're adding a permission set to the user, you have the whole entire universe of permission sets, and you just add whatever permission sets to a user. You can't add a duplicate permission set. You add it once and that's it. Same thing with remove. You could only remove permission sets that is assigned to the user. So that seems to be logical. But when you're building flows, Flow doesn't know anything. Like, it doesn't have a UI that prevents you from doing those things. So in our automation, we need, before we assign a permission set, we want to check to see if that user is already assigned to that permission set. Because if they are, then, and you try to assign it, your flow is going to fault because they'll say duplicate permission set. And the same thing goes with removing a permission set. So before you go and remove a permission set, you have to check to see if the user is already signed to the permission set, and then in the next step, delete it. Because again, if you try to delete something that doesn't exist, your flow is going to fault. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the componentized permission flow that I created for adding and removing a permission set. So let me stop the PowerPoint and go into our flow. So I'm not going to go step by step into how I created it, but we'll just talk through generally what's happening in this flow. So in the first step, we're going to do a get records, and we're going to take a look at the permission set object where the name equals the permission set name. Now remember, that's the API name of the permission set that Process Builder passed over into Flow. And then once I find it, I'm going to stop at the first record, and I'm going to take the ID and put it in a variable permission set ID.
Jen, can you zoom in your screen, please?
Okay. Is that better, Rakesh?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, and then our next step is we're going to do a check. So it's basically, we want to check to see that a permission set was found in the previous step. So here I have a condition to look at that variable is now false, two negatives equal a positive. That means it found the permission set. And then we have the default outcome, which is no permission set. So assuming we have the permission set ID, we're going to go into our next step, which is to find the permission set assignment. We're going to see if that user is already assigned to that perm set. So we're going to do a query of that permission set assignment. So that's that junction object that I talked about, where the assignee ID equals the variable user ID. Again, that's passed from process builder. And then permission set ID equals the variable in that permission set ID that we just looked up. And we're going to take the assignee ID and I'm going to store it into this other variable. So I do best practice, check the box here, that if it didn't find any records, we will assign null so that in our decision, we can check for a null value. So here's my decision where I'm validating whether I found a permission set or not. And then based on the action of adding and removing, we have different paths that we're going to take in Flow. So with the add process builder path with no permission, I'm going to check that this variable var user has permission set is null true. That means the user doesn't have this permission set already. And then our action passed from process builder is to add a permission set. Again, we can't add a duplicate, so that's why we're doing this check here. And then my other path is removing. So again, we're checking the permission set is null false. It has that permission set. And then our action passed from process builder is to remove the perm set. Then with the path add permission set, we're going to create a record. And this is on the permission set assignment. So that's that junction object. And we have the assignee ID equals the user ID and the permission set ID. And then for the remove path, we just have the remove records function, again, on the permission set assignment with the same conditions. And that's our first use case. So now let me go back to the PowerPoint. All right. And let me just make this other change here so we can see the automation. Okay. Okay. Our next use case, we have a new requirement to build an interface where we can easily assign a selected group of permission sets to the user. So we have a solution that meets the requirements. So we built a screen that allows a user to, allows a person to select the user and the permission set to assign. Then what we want to do is just make sure that the user isn't assigned to the permission set before we want to assign it. So what we did was we made a copy of that previous flow that I just went through. We added that screen element here in the box. And then my requirements do not include removing. So I just deleted the delete records piece, which also deleted the outcome. So this does the trick, right? We created a different flow that handles that situation. But again, as I mentioned, there are multiple ways to do something in Salesforce. So in this case, a better design of this would, again, we're still creating that screen to capture the user and the permission set, but we're not building, again, a separate copy of all the steps of that original flow. What we're doing instead is we're bringing in a subflow. So that's a pointer that goes and points it to that original flow. So, and the benefits of that is if I need to make a change to that overall original flow, I'm making it there. and I'm not going back and making it here as well. So I'm maintaining it once, I'm regression testing it once, I'm deploying it once. So not multiple times. All right, so now we're going to flip back to the demo. So this is the one where I got sloppy and I just cloned the original flow and I added the screen here. And then just to show you what I did with the screen, if those of you are interested, this is a screen flow. I use the out-of-the-box lookup Lightning component where I am using the user lookup. So this is the API name that I use, created by ID field API off of the account object so that we could do a lookup of the users. And I made it required, and then I assign the selected user to my variable var user ID. Now that's the same variable that we use and pass from Process Builder into Flow. So this is another way that I'm using that setup. And then for permission sets, I did a radio button, and these are static choices that I created for the ABC permission set, DEF permission set, and the sales console user. And the values that I'm storing is the API name for the permission set. So that's similar to what I passed in the permission set name field from Process Builder that we walked through earlier. So if you haven't brought in subflows into your flows, it's pretty simple. So all you need to do is just find the subflow component, drag it in, then search for the name of your flow that you're looking for. So luckily that's the first one. And then you give it a name. So we'll put test for now. Oops. And here I want to send in the var PB permission set action. Now, if you remember from Process Builder, I either added the string add or remove. So in this case, we're adding the permission set. So I'm just going to type that in there because it's going to send it into that original flow. And then we're going to do permission set name. And here I'm going to look for the screen component. And this is what the person on the screen selected for the perm set answer. So that I'm going to pass over into that original flow so it knows what permission set. So again, that's the API name of the permission set that will be passed. And then lastly, I also want to include the var user ID. And this, I'm selecting this variable, and that will pass that value into that other flow. So it's very similar to what we did in Process Builder, but I'm doing it from a flow into another flow. All right. So now let me go back into my PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so on to our second use case. So we assign automated tasks to users, but we occasionally run into issues with our automation when a user leaves the company and we didn't go back and reassign the record to another active user. So our scheduled task automations end up failing because the system cannot assign a task to an inactive user. And we have this other use case where task assignment information needs to be updated, and they're hard-coded, I use the word hard-coded, in a process or a flow. So if we need to change the subject of our task, then we're now going to have to go back and clone or create a new version of our process and flow and update the information, regression test it, and deploy it. And for those of you who subscribe to my blog, I did a blog post on why we do not want to hard code information and how to work around that. So what we did here was we created a custom metadata type that holds information about our tasks. So here's just an example of information I'm capturing: the subject, the status, the due date, which is number of days from today. And then I also have the name of the user who we would assign tasks to, who is actually active in the system. This could be just a generic user that you use for this example. I'm using my own name. Now, if you're not familiar with what a custom metadata type is, if you've created a custom object, you could essentially create a custom metadata type. The difference between the two, custom objects stores your business or customer information. So those could be your sales, donations, applications, leads. The records are data, so that means it's not deployable. So you can't take your data records from a sandbox and move it to production, or when you do a refresh or sandbox creation, those data records do not come down into your sandboxes, except for a full copy sandbox. The data is accessed via a tab. Users interface with the custom object records, and it ends with __C. Now, custom metadata type, on the other hand, stores information about your app or your org. So these could be IDs, instructional text, different mappings that you have. The records here are metadata, which means they're deployable. So you could create these custom metadata type records in a sandbox and deploy them all the way up to production. You create new sandboxes or do a refresh, and those custom metadata type records will automatically come down. Now, it's only assessed via setup, and it's really your app or your org that interfaces with the custom metadata type records. And the object ends in __MDT. When would you use a custom metadata type? So if you have application or org information that is referenced in multiple components, whether they're config or code, it could be formulas, validation rules, process, flow, or code, and you want to maintain it once, not multiple times. You might have mapping, such as a state to tax rate mapping, or information, again, that's subject to change that you do not want hard-coded anywhere in code, process, flow, formula, what have you. That's a candidate. Or you have application data of a similar structure, in our case, test information. Or you could store environment variables in there. So let's say you have application information or hyperlinks that go to different integrations. You might have a test URL and your production URL is different. Then you could use custom metadata type to hold those records that are just for production, for UAT, for SIT, versus having to override them in each of your environments. All right, so back to a regularly scheduled program. So here is the flow that I created that will handle the task assignment piece. So I could reuse this component over and over again, and if I need to make a change to it, I'm just making it once. So in our current design, our problem statement, we created a record using the create record feature in process builder or create records flow element, where we hard-coded the values of the task assignment. So when changes are needed to that information, again, we're touching the processor flow. So that becomes a maintenance issue. What we want to do here is we're pulling in information from that custom metadata type record for that specific task, and we're passing the information from a process or a flow into this flow. Then to eliminate our automation failures due to inactive user, if someone leaves the company and we didn't reassign that record ownership to an active user, then we're looking at the custom metadata type to see who we should assign those records to, or we assign it to someone as a default. But if there's an active user, we'll take that record owner and then pass to them. All right, so this flow will handle all those things. And then in our process, I wanted to show that I have two processes, one working on the contact and one working on the opportunity, where there's different criteria, but we're invoking the same flow. We're not hard coding anything in here. We're just sending information in variables into that flow, and then the flow does the task assignment for us. And now for the demo. So let me flip back over into setup. So here's our flow for task assignment. So I'm doing a lookup on the user object. Here where the ID equals the var record owner. And this is the ID of the record owner from process builder or another flow that we're passing into this flow as an input. We're taking the first record found, and I'm taking the value in the is active field, and I'm storing it into a variable called var record owner active status. Here I'm doing a check to see if there is a custom metadata type record that's coming into play. So I have an input variable called var CMDT task assignment is null false. Two negatives equal a positive. That means we have a CMDT record. And again, that would be information that a process or flow is passing into this flow. And then the other option is if this doesn't have a value in that variable. Then if it has a CMDT record, I'm going to do a lookup. And this is my task assignment __ MDT. So again, that's that custom metadata type that I created. And we're going to take a look at the developer name equals var CMDT task assignment. That's an input variable that I pass from my process builder or my flow. And I'm going to assign it to a record variable. And I'm going to take, in addition to the ID, I'm going to store the subject, status, due date, and the name of the unassigned user. So basically the fields from my custom metadata type. And I have only used these fields from the task for this example, but obviously there's more fields on the actual task. You might have created some other custom ones, but this is just for illustration purposes. So then once I get my CMDT information, or if there was no CMDT record, I'm going to go into my next decision, which is to see if the user is active or not. So that's checking on the record owner's active status. Remember that first step where we did the lookup of the user record. So if that variable equals true, that means the user's active. Otherwise, that user's inactive. And then if the user is inactive, what we're going to do is, again, look at the user object. And now we're going to get the name, basically the ID of the unassigned users, because I do not hard code IDs. That's why we're doing a lookup on the username. And I'm using a formula here, which I'll show you in a little bit. And then once I find that record in the user object, I'm taking an ID and assigning it to another variable called var inactive user assignment. So let me just quickly go over while we still have that on our minds, this unassigned user formula. So I know it looks a little bit complex, but what it does is it takes that CMDT record for that named of unassigned user field, and it says if it's blank, then our unassigned user is Addison Dogster. And a better way could be that I pulled it from a custom label instead of hard coding it here. Otherwise, we're going to take the name of the unassigned user from our custom metadata type. So once we got the assignment of the inactive user, or if the user is active, then we're going to create the task record. So we're doing a create records, one on the task object, and I just have a bunch of fields that I'm setting on the task. And then these are just formula fields. So just going to show you an example because they're pretty similar. Here we have if the task, the variable var task status is blank, then we're going to take whatever was in the custom metadata type record status field. Otherwise, we're going to use the task variable. All right, and then that's our genericized flow that we can reuse multiple times. Let me go back to my presentation. Great. Okay, our third use case is we're going to automate a process by assigning users a user story to me and changing the status to review in progress with one button click. So the way that we created it was one, update records, and then a flow that we're handling errors. Our enhancement request is sometimes there are multiple people that are assigned to reviewing a user story, and we currently don't have a way to identify those multiple reviewers, but we only want to capture that user story reviewer once. So we modified our existing flow to now include the steps of creating a record in a user story reviewer child table. So we're looking up that child table, seeing if the user already exists as a reviewer. If they don't, then we're going to create that record. Now, for those additional user story reviewers, we're going to have a button on our page that allows them to click it, and then that will create the user story reviewer record in that child table for them. So again, it's the same steps. We're doing a lookup to see if they exist, and then that's a decision. If they don't exist, we're going to create the record. So we have two flows with the same 3 steps. Duplication. So again, multiple ways to do something in Salesforce. That was the easier way. But if we need to make a change to this process, we're going to now touch 2 flows, regression test 2 flows, deploy 2 flows. So instead, what I'm going to do for better design is we're going to update that original assign a user story reviewer and bring in the subflow, because those were 3 repeated steps that apply to creating a user story reviewer record. So again, we're maintaining it once and not multiple times. So back here, this is my original user story for the reviewer, and all this does is it assigns the record ID, the status, and the user story reviewer to the current user. Then this is the revise piece where oh, this is, sorry, the create a user story reviewer, where I have those 3 steps. And then this is the updated user story reviewer, again, with the same 3 steps. So instead, as I showed you before, I just brought in that Subflow into here and configured it. So when you click in the Subflow, you'll see that I'm calling the flow called create a user story of reviewer record. And as an input, I'm passing over to that other flow my record ID, and then from there it knows what to do with that flow. All right. Okay, going back to the PowerPoint, onto our last use case. So our last use case, when a flow faults, I want to send an email to the production support team. So I have these 2 steps where I look up a custom metadata type to get my email addresses, because email addresses could change over time. And then I have another step that sends a fault email with the flow information to that production support email addresses. So I added the step to this flow. This was the child user story reviewer flow that we just went through. And then I added it to another flow. And so I basically added these 2 steps to every single flow in my org. So now what happens when you need to make a change to that flow? A major headache, because now I need to go into every single flow and modify it. So this is a real use case. I did this in my orgs. This was when I was first learning how to do flows. I didn't really know about subflows, and it was my teammate, Michael Stevenson, who said, hey, why don't you bring in the subflow, and then you don't have to manage it multiple times. So I know gas, I know I did this mistake myself. So what we did was we did a subflow. So I took those 2 steps because they're repeatable, and I made it into its own flow. And then all I did was now go back to every single flow and bring that in as a subflow. So then here, what you would just literally do is you delete this, and then you bring in the subflow. And these are, this is off of the fault connector. So when you, in your happy path, you would just have the regular connectors, and then you would have a fault connector, something happened. And this is something that we do for any DML actions that we have in our system. So that's DML is a database action. So it's create, update, get records, or delete. So what I set up is we'll type in our flow name. So this could be CAS assignment, whatever our flow name here. And then I want to send in the fault message for the flow. So we're going to go all the way down here to global variables. We're going to do flow and fault message. And then that's done. And to create that fault connector, you just draw the line and then you see fault. So it's automatically the second line that you draw from a flow element. Now this is the last flow element in my flow. Oops, I didn't mean to move that. So when I draw it, see, that's the regular connector. So if you left it like this, after you created your record, it's going to then accidentally send a fault email message when the flow actually didn't fault. So you draw the second line here where you see the fault, then highlight the initial one and delete it. So I know that took a while for me to figure out that workaround. And let's go back to our deck. Okay. So to recap, we want to apply the dry code concept, software development concept, don't repeat yourself, to declarative automation. In 2020, we're going to work smart, not hard. We're going to create these genericized flows for reuse. So we're building once, we're maintaining it once. We're not creating multiple copies and creating a maintenance nightmare for yourselves. Then we're going to use process builder or flow to send information into that genericized flow so we know what, so the flow knows what it needs to do with that information. And then for process builder, you want to just focus on one process. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Rakesh, what do we have out there?
Thank you, Jan. It was very, very good and very informative. Now, someone asked, can you show the process builder again later to see how the variable came into the flow?
Do you recall what process
I think if I remember
builder?
the
Is that
first
the permission set one?
yes, I think the one, the permissions, that one.
All right, hold on. Okay. So the example of is a new finance user that is new. You want the flow piece, right? Is that the question, Rakesh?
Yes. So
Okay.
how you pass the variable to flow?
All right. So here I'm invoking the flow, launching a flow, and I have my 3 input variables for my flow. So the variable user ID, I'm doing a field reference and passing over the ID of the user record that and kicked off this process. Then I'm typing in the word add. So my flow is looking at the word add or remove into this variable var permission set action. And then I also have, lastly, a var permission set name where I'm typing in the API name for the permission set for then my flow to look up the ID to do the assignment.
Awesome. Next, can you show the MDT from your second example and talk about how different records in MDT work?
Okay, so here's my custom metadata type. So you get to it by custom metadata types and setup. And I created my task assignment, custom metadata type. And then here are the fields that I created. It's really to match whatever fields you need on your task assignment. But for the records itself, you get to it by manage task assignments. And I have 2 different ones. So I created this list view so you could see the information here. So I have one that's on the contact assignment, and then one's doing a task assignment off of the opportunity. So if I go into one, it's just information that I'm putting in that's related to that task for contacts. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Next, if the user don't know the API name, do you have a way to provide description or other text in the flow, or let them choose permission set from a pick list, etc.?
If I don't have, can you read that again?
So if the user does not know the API name, do you have a way to provide descriptions or other text in the flow, or let them choose permission set from a pick list?
So in one of my examples in the screen piece, let me see if I can find it. Maybe it's up front. Here, these weren't dynamically generated. So these are static pick list choices that I created. So I have a ABC perm set, DEF perm set, that piece. So just quickly to show you what I did here was here I put in the API name. So if you don't have the API name, if you can target off of some other thing, I usually do the API name just because I don't like using field labels because they might change, and if someone didn't know that there's a dependency in your automation for a field name, then your process will break. So that's why I don't hard code IDs and things like that. I target off of something on that record that you can use. But API names is a best practice for me. But you can target off of something else on that field to look up.
Awesome. Next, have you done a flow where you pass a record down into Subflow and back up to the master flow doing the update or DML?
Yeah, you can have a flow. So let me just exit out of this. Let me go find my little subflow here. Okay. So this could have, like, let's say it went, say, instead of this way, you're saying in the case like this, where you were in your master, and let's pretend this is a connection versus a fault. You go to Subflow, it does its thing, then it comes back to the master. Then in your Subflow, you're going to need to account for output values, right? You're going to need to be passing that back into your master flow. So in that actual flow, it would have to have outputs that it stores and passes back.
Next, process builder only passes one record at a time down to the flow. So is there a good way to try to bulkify a flow?
I'm just possible. So you really need to so before you determine whether process builder is the right tool for whatever you're automating, you need to understand the number of records that in the situations that you have. So if you ever have situations where you're going to need to deal with a lot of records, process builder is not the appropriate automation tool. Trigger would be the appropriate tool. Is there anything else, Rakesh?
No, I'm still looking, refreshing every other channel to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, no. So someone said thanks for your time and sharing your vast knowledge. Oh. So,
Well, you're welcome.
someone said thank you. Okay, thanks, Jen.
And I will see Larry, you at Cactus Force. Great.
So no more questions.
All right. Cool. So as I mentioned, sometime after this session, give us time to post the recording as well as the deck that will be available on our Automation Hour YouTube channel. So search for Automation Hour and you can get all our videos. We will also post that information to the Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community, as well as tweet it out, that the link to the recording as well as the deck. So with that, thank you for joining us for our first session in 2020. We have a lot of great sessions to come. So our next session is with our other co-host, Rakesh, on the 24th. So join us for that. And with that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.